No day but today. So, I've got a confession to make. I like Rent. I like the music. I like the show. It was honestly, that soundtrack was one of my go-to albums when I was in high school. I like it quite a bit. And I've noticed that over time there's been kind of a building backlash, maybe too strong a word, but a building inclination of people to do takedowns and explain why Rent isn't good or what's wrong with it or things of that nature. And I kind of want to address those because I think they're tied into one specific thing that is a problem, but I think people have their wrong headspace about it. So, a couple things about Rent. First of all, if for some reason you're watching this and you don't really know Rent it was a Broadway show that came out in the 90s about a bunch of bohemian characters living, or squatting more accurately, in a building and sort of what they're going through. It's an update of La Boheme, but instead of half the characters having tuberculosis, half the characters have HIV or AIDS. So it's just a story of roughly about a year of their lives or so. Kind of, first act is one night, and then the second act sort of jumps across time as it goes along. And as I said, I have noticed, or at least within the YouTube circles that I circulate, a surprising, at least to me, number of videos, takedowns, diatribes, rants going on about how garbage Rent is. And I think they're wrong. Or at least the criticisms that they're leveling are being unfairly applied. And first, let me say, if you don't like Rent and it's because of things like, I just don't like the style of music, fine. That's totally valid. But what I'm going to address here are the sorts of things that I've seen folks do when, trying to quantify a reason. Basically, when people do these sort of takedown videos, they may say they're giving a reason why they don't like Rent. More often than not, it feels like they're giving a reason why nobody should like Rent. Some of them get a little more high on their horse than others, but that's the vibe that you get. And the arguments being applied aren't subjective arguments. They're not, well, I don't like the music. Well, I don't, like this or that. It is, well, there's this thing. There's this thing about this story, about these characters, and it's wrong. It's bad. It's a bad message. I'm expected to root for these people. It's things along those lines. And like I said, I think it's unfair, and I'll explain why. So the first thing that I point out, and I think part of the reason this has been happening, I think, at least from my perspective, in the last decade or so, is because the movie came out. And I think that's not to say that nobody disliked Rent back when it was just a stage play and a Broadway soundtrack, but I think it became a lot easier to criticize once there was a movie. Because when it comes to something that's a play, it's difficult to criticize anything other than the specific performance that you saw. It is difficult to criticize the thing as a whole unless there are like massive glaring fundamental flaws in it, because you don't know if you just saw a bad performance. You can't count on your audience having the same point of reference. You can't count on them having seen seen it at all, if whether it be on Broadway or in a touring show or even like a local well-staged production of it. You can't count on them having seen that. So when you try and do a takedown of a play, well, your audience doesn't have the frame of reference you do. They may not have seen it at all, or if they have, there's absolutely no guarantee that what they saw was what you saw. Film Totally different game. You know, when talking about a film, that anyone who's seen it saw what you saw. Maybe they don't have the same takeaways, maybe they don't have the same reactions to it, but at the very least, the base level and where you start is the same. Everybody saw the same movie. And so I think that is why we started to see more of these criticisms come about after the movie, because suddenly there was a point of reference that people who didn't like Rent could all point to and go, there. Okay, now you can see what I'm talking about without having to pay to go to New York and see it on Broadway. But like I said, the criticisms, the common criticisms that I see about this generally have to do with arguments about the characters, how they act, how they behave, their values, and that the show is expecting audiences to sympathize and to, at the very least, like them. And a lot of these takedowns basically go through lists of why these are unlikable, horrible people. And so some of the criticisms that you get. So you get things along the, well, I think in many ways it's encapsulated by the character of Benny, who in the film is played by Taye Diggs, who was also part of the original cast. I'll be coming back to that element. It's kind of a big part of where I'm going with this. But Benny is portrayed within the story of Rent basically as a sellout. He, all these people were friends for a while, and they've all got artistic ambitions. You know, you've got a songwriter and a dancer, and you've got a sort of philosophy professor, and you've got a would-be filmmaker and a musician. So all these people have these artistic ideals for what they're going to do with their lives. And Benny is basically, he's married into money, and now he's working on corporatizing, gentrifying, and otherwise sort of bringing in financial stability, and he's offering them a chance to, from their perspective, sell out as well. And so when you get the criticisms of Rent these days, what you get is Benny is not a bad guy. Benny is like the most reasonable person here. And all these other people, they want to live rent-free in a building, and like they leave stable positions in order to pursue things that are never gonna work. Like, these people are stupid and selfish and self-righteous and self-important. They're so convinced of their own genius. Like, these people are insufferable. How could anybody like them? And I think that's a valid criticism of the movie, but not the play. And that may seem like an odd statement because the movie changes virtually nothing. There's a couple of tiny tweaks and a couple of cut songs, but nothing substantively is changed from the play to the movie. And more to the point, they brought back the original cast. But that's actually where they caused the problem. And that's not to say that the original cast is bad. The original cast is great. But by bringing them back for the film, that caused, or at least opened the door to the problem, because it was about a decade. And what that means is the various things that I've talked about, these characters over-idealizing their artistic ambitions, seeing the idea of seeking stability as selling out, those are the perspectives in the play of people in their 20s. And let's be honest, when you're in your 20s, a lot of us are kind of dumb because we've gotten through our teens, and now we survive that, and now we think we know how everything works, or we think we can bend the world to make it work the way we want it to work. But as you get older, I think a lot of us tend to grow out of this stuff. And when these sorts of points of view are being espoused by people in their 20s, some people may still not like it, but personally, I think that makes a big difference between that and people in their 30s behaving in this same way. Because if you're in your 30s, and to single out the character of Mark as a good go-to, he is the aspiring filmmaker, and he's been trying to make, he calls it his film. He's been trying to make something for a while, and he basically accidentally stumbles into a steady paying job with the 90s equivalent of TMZ. And it pays well, but he doesn't enjoy it. It's soul sucking. And he quits that job to work full time on his film. that has no distribution. He has no guarantee that he will finish it, anyone will ever watch it, or he'll ever make any money off of it. For someone in their 20s to do that, it may still not be a good decision, but somebody that young, like, this is the age to try. In your 20s is the age to make a go of it, because you're young enough to be in the best position to bounce back, to have the energy and to have the drive to recover if this fails. And so when somebody in their 20s is like, no man, I'm going to focus full time on my film, like, again, from a macro point of view, you may still be going, that's kind of dumb, but you kind of feel like going, okay, you know what? Best of luck to you, dude. When a guy in his 30s quits a steady paying job in order to basically cut together his home movies, that's not endearing, that's insane. And that age jump on almost all the characters, because there were a couple who were recast for the film, but almost all the characters are now visibly in their 30s instead of in their 20s. And if these ideas that I'm talking about them having in their idealization and other stuff, if it seems weird that I'm saying it's more acceptable at one age than another, I think a lot of times in criticism, people latch on to concepts in stories and don't consider the actual source. And by source, I don't mean the story. I mean, what character, what circumstance is that actually coming out of? I think a good recent example of that is Kylo Ren in The Last Jedi. Again, I don't really like The Last Jedi, but the problems I have are not the problems that it seems like the most vocal detractors of that film seem to have, for the most part. But a lot of people latched onto Kylo Ren's line of, let go of the past, kill it if you have to. And, people are going, and this is what Rian Johnson's doing with the movie. He's saying we have to kill our love of Star Wars. And I'm like, wait, hold on. If you want to make that argument, you want to back it up substantively with things throughout the film, fine. But if you're latching onto only that one line, does it matter to you at all that it's being said by the bad guy? Somebody who we have every reason to inherently distrust? Is that really what you really think the message of a film is being carried by the villain? I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm not saying that never happens, but like, there's a reason that philosophy was put into the mouth of a character we have every reason to distrust. I think I started thinking about this more. This was a while back I first saw this, but when Kevin Smith was doing his speaking tours of colleges and stuff, and he got into a conversation during a Q&A section with a student at one of the colleges he went at, talking about his film Chasing Amy. Now, if you haven't seen Chasing Amy, broad thing, make real short, basically a woman who previously identified as a lesbian begins dating a man. And there's a lot of other stuff going on, but that's the main thrust of it, and that's what the conversation was about. And the student asked him, don't you feel that the way you presented all of this is that she, at the end of the day, just needed... She quotes the term used in the movie, which is too explicit for me to say on this channel because I like to keep it clean, but aren't you basically saying she just needed to be with a man? And what Kevin Smith pointed out was that specific sentiment that the student parroted back in the exact words from the film, that sentiment is spoken by a character in the film who is demonstrably wrong about everything. Like, he's always wrong, and he's kind of a jerk. And Kevin Smith made the point of saying, like, there's a reason I gave that line to that character. Now, you could still make an argument that the film as a whole is still, pushing forward that message and that there's other problematic elements to it, and that's fine, but it really does make the point. Who says something, and the details of that character make a lot of difference. Which brings me back to Rent again. Because the way that these characters are living, for people in their 20s, while I'm not saying necessarily some grand heroic thing, there is something endearing about how optimistic they are, about the impact they're going to leave on the world, about what their art can mean, about how they could possibly live their lives. reality is likely going to beat that out of them over the course of their lives. We don't see that in the play necessarily or the film, but you can kind of presume that. When you see characters in their 20s acting dumb, I think sometimes people go, well, that's stupid. They should know this, 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 and this. And I'm like, you're saying that from the perspective of somebody who has lived past that and who does know better, and they haven't gotten there yet. But you give these same traits to somebody in their 30s, and suddenly you're going, why are you in your 30s and you haven't realized that this isn't going to work? Because that's the thing. The characters in their 20s, yes, they haven't realized that the way they're trying to live probably is not going to work out for them long term, but that's the thing. They're in their 20s. They haven't had enough experiences to know for certain and feel confident that that is the lesson that they have learned, if they learn it at all. Whereas somebody in their 30s, they should have learned that by now. And if they weren't going to adjust their lives accordingly, at the very least, they should not be acting as naive. Now, I'm not saying there's no like bohemian lifestyle people in their 30s or 40s or even older. I've met some of them. But when they get to that age, they usually at the very least have a more realistic outlook on how they live their lives and don't have this bizarre, naive idolization. You know, they're living their lives how they want to, but the naivete, that at the very least that sheds, if not a complete outlook on life sheds, over the course of a decade, from your 20s to your 30s, as you just live. And yeah, these points of view become harder to sympathize with, and these characters become more unlikable if they're this age and acting this way than if they're in their 20s and acting this way. I mean, heck, think about any teenage comedy, especially like the teenage sex comedies, most of which have aged very badly and are very problematic. But like, even setting that aside, think about how weird a lot of those things would be if these characters weren't teenagers, but were 25, 35, 45. And again, you know, yes, I know things like 40-Year-Old Virgin basically ran with that concept, but that was an attempt at subverting the whole thing. But just think about if something like American Pie, maybe with removing the losing virginity element, but imagine the plot of American Pie being, we're all going to have sex with these people we've selected by X date, you know, towards the end of the year. Coming from people, honestly, any older than teen years, that's creepy. That's weird. Coming from teenagers, again, you know, I understand it's now problematic and all that, but like coming from teenagers, certainly at the time it was released, you go, oh, I'm kids. And, you know, I will always take issue with the phrase boys will be boys, especially the way it tends to get applied a lot of times these days. But there is a reason that term exists. There is a certain amount of acceptance that people, I mean, forget boys specifically, people in their youth, that's when we make our mistakes. And we make our mistakes in our youth so that we can learn from them and mature as adults. But if we have become if we're at an age where we should be adults and we're still making the mistakes that one would expect a teenager or 20-something to be making, that becomes a problem. That becomes less, we're watching people on a journey of wherever they're going to end up in their lives, and it becomes, we're watching people who are stuck in a rut that they are never going to get out of because they should have gotten out of it by now. And that is why I feel this criticism of Rent, which I think does apply to the movie, but has been unfairly pushed out to the entirety. You know, the whole thing is like, oh, Rent is dumb because of this. Well, no, it works in the play because they're not in their 30s in the play, and it does make a difference. So, those are my thoughts and my sort of defense of a play that I love and a film that I enjoyed at the time I saw it, but have come to see this problem with it. But again, I feel that, and if you want to apply that criticism to the film, fine. Don't say that that means the play doesn't work. Because that problem, I would argue, doesn't exist on stage. So, those are my thoughts on that. God, I wish there was a date or something that I could tie this into, because this is going to come out of nowhere. But in any case, folks, whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do, too, because there's links and there's buttons down there. Check them out if you feel like it. There's a link to the Patreon, feel like supporting me that way. But even if you don't sweat it, because at the end of the day, you are the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.